Okay, hello, and welcome to the mini series all about steps towards sustainable behavior change. I am so excited to be doing this mini series for all of you because this is essentially the framework that I have used with myself and with my clients, and I'm restructuring it in a very expansive way. And I figured what better way to move towards this process by walking you all through it with my own behavior that I am currently working through and want to really expand and tweak my own behaviors because I have quote unquote fallen off track recently with my own behaviors. And I wanted to show you all essentially how I walk through all of that. One, with the mindset work surrounding it. Two, with looking at and incorporating my values as I focus on these specific habits and behaviors. And three, just really allowing you all to walk through this sustainable process of understanding how to navigate behavior change in a supportive way that's compassionate and that really allows you to lean into that deeper context and supporting yourself really with your values rather than falling into self-sabotage or falling into old patterns, which does happen. We are human, and like I am a perfect example of that happened with me recently. And in that process, sometimes we have to like pull ourselves back to current day, current us, and reconnect with our values and reconnect with that compassionate lens towards ourselves. So, sometimes we fall into that self sabotage. And I'm going to walk through that in this episode today of really what's been going on with me. And this episode, so this is step one of the steps towards sustainable behavior change, is all about baseline data. So before I go into any of that, I wanted to pause in this moment to say, if you are a visual learner, I would highly recommend pausing this episode on your Apple or Spotify or whatever you're listening to it auditory, and hop towards my YouTube channel because I'm actually going to be sharing my screen and showing you the visual data of the past 10 days of my behavior and walking it through. So I'm going to verbally explain and provide the descriptions of everything. But if you're a visual person like me, it is so fascinating and really supportive for our brains to get behind and understand evidence when we get that visual representation. So this is your moment to pause, hop on over to YouTube. I will put the link in the show notes of the YouTube episode so that you can come and see it visually as I walk you all through it. So baseline data, what the heck is it? And if you're not on my email list or haven't seen me on Instagram, I've shared about it recently. So essentially, baseline data is where you are currently at in your life. And a big component of this baseline data is a lot of the time people get slip up in this area when they want to make a change in their lives. They jump to the behavior and they're like, I no longer want to do that, or I want to change that. And they immediately go to trying to change it without knowing where they're currently at. So last time I gave an example of the average steps everyone takes in a day is like typically 10,000. You hear 10,000 steps a day. That's kind of like the common thing, right? And so that's an arbitrary goal, right? And since you hear it everywhere, you just say to yourself, oh, I want to get 10 steps in. I feel like I'm not getting enough steps. So I'm just going to aim for 10,000. But you haven't taken your baseline data to know like how many steps are you actually taking in a day? Like, where is that objective, clear, you know, no judgment data of just like, where's the numbers, right? And, you might actually be, let's say, around 2,000 steps a day, but you don't know that because you're not actually tracking that to know. And then what happens is if you pick this arbitrary average of 10,000 steps without knowing your baseline and where you're currently at, then it can be so much more challenging to improve and support that goal, and you can easily fall off track a lot quicker, and you can lead which can lead to burnout, frustration, and giving up a lot quicker. It is way more likely that you will engage in old behaviors or fall into all or nothing and be like, well, like, it's 3 days in a row, I'm nowhere near it, so why bother? And we can get so wrapped up in that really quickly when it comes to wanting to change our behaviors. So, a great first step in the very beginning of everything is, this is the part where we got to be like judgment free. Like, I don't care what happens. I'm just going to be writing down the numbers, checking the boxes to see what the heck am I doing. And this can, whatever you end up taking data in and how you're tracking it, wherever you want to track it is cool. So I've made an Excel spreadsheet and I essentially have been tracking morning routine. Did I eat lunch? Did I do coaching business work? Did I walk or move? Did I go to bed by 10? And then water, steps, and how many hours of sleep. And then I wanted to also list my current morning habits and my current night habits. So those are all the things on my list. But before I share my screen and go through the data, I really just wanted to give this context when it comes to baseline behavior. And the big component about it is when we start to collect this data, we want to start changing our behavior. Like, for instance, if we're thinking about steps and you realize it's been 2 days and you're like, ooh, I've been around 2,000. Oh, like today was 2,500, but like, wow, that's really low, like, or like lower than I thought, right? And then the next day we might want to be like, okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to try to like boost that up, right? And when we start to do that, we're falling out of our baseline of where we're currently at. And honestly, this, like, I'll typically say 7 to 10 days of data to just simply collect to get those numbers and try your best not to alter it in that moment, because once you get that solid week or so of data, you can then assess, then choose the behaviors you wish to change, alter, modify, and support, right? And so this whole process is honestly really exciting. Like, I mean, I'm a behavior analyst and a mindset and behavior change coach. So there are definitely elements where I love all the data and the tracking. But without further ado, I am going to share my screen. So hop on to YouTube if you're not there yet. Okay, so on the screen here, we've got everything I just listed out right now. And I started tracking from last Monday, so April 10th, all the way until yesterday, which was April 19th. So visually in this life baseline data that I have some shocking information, or at least for me, which was just really cool to go through. So my morning routine, I did not engage in it any days. So I had a total of 10 days of data and I completed it 0 times. Now I'm going to go into more detail about that one specifically, but I'm just going to go through all of the areas. So engaging in a morning routine, I considered that I did not engage in that at all out of these 10 days. And my lunch, I actually ate my lunch 7 out of 10 days, which was actually really great. I wanted to track that because a lot of the times I'll skip my lunch because as a school-based BCBA, I am going from one school and then driving to another school in the afternoon. So most of the time I'm in the car. And so I've been figuring out how to navigate making sure I eat something and I have car snacks. And anyway, so I wanted to just track that. So I'm actually really happy to see I did eat my lunch 7 out of 10 days. And that also includes like Saturdays and Sundays too. And then biz work, I literally did 2 out of 10 days, but you know what? That is totally fine. I'm in my process of building up my consistency with work in the coaching aspect. So that was just also interesting to see as well. And then walking and moving, walking, I have definitely been doing a lot more of because it's been a lot nicer outside. And I put slash move because there are sometimes I like exercise and do a bit more activity. And I will say I did 6 out of 10 days for this one. And the caveat here is that last week I had 2 events. I went to a baseball game and then I went out for dinner with my friend and we actually walked around the town. And then Ian and I on Sunday walked all around the city. And those are out of the ordinary for me to all happen within like 1 week's time. So that actually ties into my steps for the week. I'll jump to the steps area. I got an average of 6,552 steps in the week, which was actually not to say high for me, but there's a handful of days that are very high, and that's not typical for me. And on other days, I've done like Orange Theory classes, and those count because I run on a treadmill. So for the most part, walking and moving was 6 out of 10 days. But there are definitely a lot of days, I would say more so outside of this, that I am not walking or moving. But you know what? I will take this data, 6 out of 10. And then what was interesting is if you're visually seeing this with me, bed by 10 was, I wanted that to be a checkbox. Like, did I get into bed by 10 p.m.? Yes or no? And for the first part, so I had it originally as a checkbox, and then I ended up switching to the time I went to bed because the first 4 days I did not go to bed by 10, and I was more curious about the time I went to bed so that I could choose to see what the average was. And then that could help dictate when would be a good time to say. Because, for example, for this habit, I said bed by 10 kind of arbitrarily, or at least 10 o'clock was like my ideal best time that I wanted to go to bed. But I knew I had been staying up really late. So this was actually very interesting for me because me setting the goal in my baseline data of like bed by 10, check it off, yes, no, was actually not a good representation of the data because it didn't allow me to figure out like what was my average time that I did go to bed at. So the average time, I had to do this weird, not in the time format in Excel, but it was 12:30. So like just after midnight was my average time that I went to bed. There were nights where I went to bed at like 1, 2. There was one night, last night actually, I went to bed at 11, but that was the earliest I had gone to bed. So I have been going to bed very late. And it's funny because when I reflect on this, like the past few weeks, I have very much been living and operating as like 20-year-old Sonia. Like in my 20s, honestly, my whole life really. Like I was one of those 90s kids where like, MSN was such a huge thing when I was like in grade school and high school. And so I was one of those kids that stayed up late talking on MSN. And so ever since like high school and going into university and then in my 20s, like partying and all of these things, like I was that student and that person that I considered myself a night owl. And I prided myself on that growing up. And so that it's just so interesting to reflect on that because with this data, I was noticing like I felt like I was going back into my 20s and I was going back into time and I was staying up late, doing all these old habits. And that's the thing, we can slip back into those like past versions of ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like that's human, that's natural, that's going to happen. So that's why I was excited to take this data because I wanted to know like what was going on. So with that said, I shifted my habit that I was going to track of bed by 10 p.m. And I started to fill out the exact time I got into bed. And that was really eye-opening. So now that's going to help me assess where I want to be with that habit going forward. So just for context, in this mini series, I'm going to be sharing like step by step very clearly. So in this episode, I'm really just expressing and sharing my data from the baseline. Next week, I'm going to dive much more into the reflection and the assessment piece and what I'm going to start tracking and why. So this week, I'm giving kind of like this little snippet of the data. And then next week is really the reflection piece. So the next part in my chart was how much water I was intaking. So I put it in ounces, and I'm getting about 33 ounces on average, which is not a lot of water. For the average person, I would say it's typically from like 60 to 80 ounces, or like 50 to 80 ounces is a good average. And I was under average. And I get migraines often. So it's interesting to also see that I was quite low in water intake. Um, if you've been following me on Instagram for a while, you totally saw my like Watergate of just like literally figuring out different water bottles and how to get myself from drinking water, and how I mistaked my ounces. I miscalculated. Anyway, it's been a whole thing. I've been on this long journey on how to increase my water, but now I am taking you guys through the process with me. So on average for the 10 days, I was drinking about 33 ounces. And then my steps, there are 3 days that my steps were very high. But on average, as I said, I was getting about 6,552 steps over these 10 days. So I will typically get 2 to 3 days of really high steps around 10,000 when I'm doing an Orange Theory class, because I'm on the treadmill for like 20 minutes in that class alone. So not to say I don't count that, but those are very isolated moments where I'm getting a lot of steps. Whereas outside of those classes, I might be very stationary, right? Like I might be sitting at my desk all day and then go do that. So I would love to do my steps outside of those classes, but there is 2 days that was over 10,000, and a third day that was almost 10,000. And what's funny is the past 3 days I have not gone to an Orange Theory class, and I have not moved a lot. So the past 3 days I did not walk or move. I did not check that off the last 3 days, and my steps were like 3,000, 3,000, 2,000. So I would say that is quite normal for me. So that's why I would love to figure this one out and increase that a little more too. And my sleep, as you can imagine, I obviously like have to wake up for work in the morning. And you guys know already that I have been going to bed at like midnight and 1. So the average sleep I was getting was about 6 hours and 45 minutes or so. And yeah, so very interesting information. And so the last two columns here are my current morning habits and my current evening my current night habits. And so I wanted to just really list out like, what am I actually doing in the mornings, and do these habits help or hinder me? And once again, I wasn't writing this out to try to change it or alter it, or be like, or shame myself for the fact that I was scrolling on my phone. I just really wanted to see, okay, when I wake up, what the heck do I do in the mornings? And before I go to bed, like, what the heck am I doing? So for my morning habits, I would roll out of bed groggy. Was quite often happening, which makes sense if I'm going to bed late and I'm hardly drinking a lot of water. Um, and I'm either moving a lot with minimal water or hardly moving at all, like either way. So I would say the quality of my sleep was not the greatest. And so I was waking up groggy. And actually, I didn't write it here, but I would probably say like hit alarm and go back to bed. That's definitely something I also do. I'm just adding that in as we go. So I would hit like turn off my alarm and go back to bed. I would make myself a protein drink in the morning. Sometimes I would eat an overnight oats if I prepped it, or a yogurt cup. And then I would drive into work. And usually somewhere in that process, I was scrolling on my phone. And yeah, so that's my morning habits. And then my night habits were, like brush teeth, wash face. Sometimes I would do my to-do list for the next day. Sometimes I would read, sometimes I would scroll on my phone, and most of the time I was watching TV or on my iPad. And a big component of this was that I was charging my devices. I didn't put this in there either. Charging my devices in my bedroom. That was a big thing that I've been navigating, and really it does make a big difference if they're not charging in my room. So overall, about my baseline data, I've noticed that there are a lot of habits that I have been doing that I am really wanting to adapt. And it was just really eye-opening to realize, what are the tiny things that I'm doing? Like, you know, charging my devices in my bedroom, like, sometimes you wouldn't even think of putting that down as a habit. But if that is the reason why I have access to my phone beside my bed at night to then go and grab from an automatic response where I'm like, I can't sleep right now. Okay, I'll roll over and grab my phone. And then I'm boom on my screen. Next thing you know, I am scrolling on my phone for way longer than I would anticipate. And so it's just so interesting how certain habits can create a ripple effect for other ones. So, what I wanted to leave you with from this episode and this information is that I really wanted to connect to, like, how do I feel after taking this data? Like, how do I feel being able to see this information? And as annoying as some of it was also just as liberating to see this information and be like, wow, okay. Like, I didn't even realize I was, like, honestly, I didn't realize there were some days where I was taking more steps than I thought. And then I was also drinking way less water than I thought. And even on the days where I might have gone into bed at 10, but then I ended up scrolling on my phone. And then by the time I like realized, I was like, Sonia, like, okay, what time is it? Okay, it's now midnight. Put your phone down and go to bed. Right. And it's like, I'm now catching it and I'm bringing it into my awareness. And that is by far the number one step. That is what this baseline data is doing. It is bringing these behaviors to the forefront of my brain and creating this awareness that I didn't have before, or I was automatically creating stories and narratives around what I thought was occurring without even actually having the evidence and the proof and the numbers to know it. Because a lot of times we'll just create these stories and be like, yeah, like I go to bed around 11 at night. And that was such a lie, because I literally went to bed at 11 one night, and all the others I was going to bed past midnight. So it's like, this data, I felt kind of silly and I was like, oh my gosh, like there's so much here, right? But at the same time, it actually felt very liberating for me to release any stories and be like, okay, data doesn't lie. And it's right in front of me. And I'm actually being able to see it objectively and clearly, and not be able to put any stories to it, because numbers are numbers. Like, it's facts. And I don't have to place meaning on that unless I place meaning on it. And we don't have to. All of this data, like me hardly drinking water, me staying up super late, me getting like hardly, like not as much sleep, or just rolling out of bed, or not doing a morning routine at all, like any of that stuff, like I could go down the rabbit hole and be like, I, really creating negative stories around my identity or who I am. But at the same time, these are the moments to liberate yourself. These are the moments to release those stories. These are the moments to realize you are not defined by these things. You are an ever evolving human that gets to make new choices every single day, hour, minute, second. Like, really think about that. You can look at this data and dwell on it and get upset at it. The fact that you did that and not move the needle forward. Or look at this data and say, okay, I have this data now. Like I've got a baseline, I've got my foundation. I now have that literal foundational layer to know where I can go from here. And that is the whole point of baseline data. And so the two questions I wanted to take away from this episode was, after you look at your own baseline data, on a scale of 1 to 10, how willing are you to change your behavior? So, like in general, on a scale of 1 to 10, how willing are you to make the changes to these behaviors? And I ask this on a scale because it's really interesting, once again, to get that number and to get that clarity to say, okay, so for me personally, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how willing am I to change my behavior? I am very much in a headspace where I want to be living a healthy and present life, an active, healthy, present, and active life. Like those are really the big things for me right now. I am very willing. So I would probably put myself at like an 8 or 9 of I am very willing and open to making these changes. But then I wanted to elaborate on that by saying another question. Okay. So with the next question here, I wanted to add a layer to that first question of, on a scale of 1 to 10, how willing am I to change my behavior? So for me, I said about an 8 or 9, which is pretty high. That's pretty good, right? And so the next layer to that is asking, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident am I with changing each of these behaviors? So when I say each, I'm probably going to choose 2 or 3 from this baseline data, and we'll go way more into detail on that next week. But how confident am I to change the time I go to bed? How confident am I to do my morning routine? And that is really where I feel like the confidence in the belief of, you know, do I feel confident that I can make that change, that I can sustain it? That would probably be a lower number for myself, to be honest. But those are things, that's really what I have for you this week. I really went into full depth on the baseline data, and this was really just step 1 of you adapting and be bringing awareness towards your current habits. And be sure to tune in next week where we talk all about the assessment and your goals and tying these to your values and what that looks like over time to really build sustainable behavior change. And if you want to follow along, be sure to catch me on Instagram and check out the YouTube channel and subscribe and follow along. And by all means, send me a DM if you found this very useful. And if you have any questions at all about baseline data, if you decide to do your own, like, by all means, send me a message. I would love to hear your story. And that is all for today. I will catch you all next week.